Hello, everyone. You made it. You made it to the end of the year, which means you have one assessment left, and it's the most important one, your exam. What are we doing today? We are looking at the current state of the economy. We're looking at some of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply factors, the contemporary aggregate demand and aggregate supply factors, and of course, some contemporary policies, which you're going to use to make your paper stand out from the rest of the cohort. Before we get into it, I just want to say a quick thank you to people who have reached out and commented and said, thank you for my videos. Thank you for watching and saying thank you, because that's the reason I keep recording them. If you have enjoyed them, pass them on to next year's batch of Year 11s. So remember, close enough is good enough when you're doing this stuff. You don't need to be perfect. If you get the first number right for inflation, real GDP growth, or full employment, that's good enough. I mean, try to get it as close as you can, but don't waste too much brain power sort of freaking out about this stuff. So why do you need to know this? Well, you get a goal question, you get any question relating to the current state of the economy, you get and evaluate the achievement of a certain goal or to assess the degree to which something has been achieved. Any of those questions, you should be referring to the current goals and the current measurement, so GDP, unemployment, or inflation. In terms of aggregate demand and aggregate supply factors, there's this very important key knowledge point, which I think is actually done quite poorly. It's the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply factors that have influenced our three goals and living standards over the past 2 years. And sort of linking to that key knowledge point is the key skill, which is you need to be able to discuss and analyze the effect of these contemporary factors on the setting of aggregate demand policy. So what is Big Phil Lowe at the RBA? What are they actually looking at in terms of AD and Aes factors when they're making their decision, or when they have made their decision over the past 6 months? And similarly, the Treasury or the Treasurer, what is he thinking when he's sitting down and constructing the budget? Okay. So let's get the goals first. So growth has been 3.9% over the last year, or almost 1% over the last quarter. You don't want to make the mistake of saying it's above target. Yes, our target's 3 to 3.5%. But strong growth is good growth because it creates jobs, which we're going to look at in a second. You may just put a little side point to say, well, it might be creating inflationary pressure, or it is creating inflationary pressure. Let's look at GDP in a different way. If we just look at it in nominal terms, so just in dollar terms, you can see that it's been pretty steady over the past up until COVID, been pretty steady. And then we had a big downturn, obviously, because of the lockdown and the shutdown of businesses. And since then, we've been sort of in an expansionary phase. Now, I think it's important to know, yes, the goal, but also which phase of the business cycle are we in? And I guess the question is, where are we going? You don't need to know that. We're definitely, in an expansionary phase. And I would probably say at the top, if not coming down off an expansionary phase. Remember, this data is lagging. So why would you need to know this? Well, there was this question a couple of years ago, which was to explain how automatic stabilizers would stabilize the business cycle. Now, if you don't know whether we're in a contraction or an expansion, I don't think you can get full marks on that question. So growth is strong. We're at the top of the expansionary phase, or maybe moving to a contraction. Inflation it's been very well documented, above target. I've never heard so many non-economics people talk about inflation before. And believe you me, I love it. But I don't love the rate of inflation. It's 6.1%, well above target. And it's what the RBA is really freaking out about. Just a little side point here. I think it's really good to understand why and what's driving inflation. So firstly, we've got, and I think probably safe to say the most important or the biggest factor is we've got the supply shocks in our energy markets, which has been caused by the Russia and Ukraine tension, but also the supply shock because China is trying to have this zero COVID policy where they don't want to have any cases. And that's led to some problems, getting goods and services, goods out of China. But also, there is also some demand side inflation as well. And that's probably the result of this expansion. Well, it is the result of this expansion coming out of our COVID lockdown. Okay, so a bit of supply, or mostly supply, and a bit of demand driving up the consumer price index. And we've got inflation at 6.1%, well above the goal. Couple of little bits there for you. The RBA is very concerned. So I think anytime you write about the RBA, their charter, or the inflation goal, you should be mentioning something along these lines. Like, it's the primary concern in the economy at the moment. It's actually a primary concern across the global economies is inflation. It hasn't been like this for a long time, but we're in an inflationary environment. So they've shown their commitment to their goal, which is outlined in their charter, by raising rates from 0.1% to 2.6% over the last 6 months. Okay. So make sure you really remember that, and you make sure you get that into your writing. Finally, the full employment goal. Remember, NAIRU is supposed to be 4 to 4.5%. That's what the textbooks say, this little green box here. And we're well below that. Now, again, you don't want to say that's bad. Like, having people in jobs and working is a good thing. I always thought it was kind of bizarre that economists thought you could have an unemployment rate too low. Isn't it about living standards? And I know it creates inflation, but I don't think you should say that that is necessarily a bad thing. The goal's been achieved. What you could say is that it could be leading to wage growth, which we'll look at in a second. And it is a very tight labour market, and it is leading to shortages, skill shortages, but the goal's been achieved. Okay, how are you going to use this? Just a little refresher. If you're talking about goal questions, well, any AD goals, you should refer to the current state, the current rate of inflation or GDP or full employment, definitely when evaluating policies. And I've got here AD only because we don't really know what's going to happen in the future. Aggregate supply policies are long-term. So you don't want to say like, the building of the Bruce Highway is going to be good for inflation now. It's not. Okay, it's probably actually going to, in theory, increase inflation now. It's a long-term policy. When you're assessing the degree to which we've achieved it, well, obviously, anytime you mention the RBA's charter, and I've got here any other opportunity you have to show off a little bit. Don't overuse it, obviously, and as long as it's within your time limits. Okay, so just to give you some examples of the past exam questions and how VCAR assesses you on this stuff, like I said, evaluate the effectiveness of monetary policy over 2020 in achieving full employment. Well, you'd have to get in there what the current full employment rate is or unemployment rate is and whether or not the goal's been achieved. This one's about aggregate demand and aggregate supply factors. And this was a very tricky question from last year's exam. And they asked, well, what did one AD, one AS factor that would actually mean the unemployment rate was below forecast? You needed a contemporary factor. And finally, describe 2 economic reasons why the government might find it difficult to get a budget surplus. All these things you can show off by showing contemporary knowledge of the economy. Oh, what happened there? And there's another one for you. Describe the performance of the economy in terms of jobs and growth. Same deal. Unemployment rate, real GDP. Okay, so let's get into the AD-AS factors. And there's the key knowledge and key skills again. Let's do some AD factors first. So firstly, if we're looking at the household, we're looking at consumer sentiment. And I think this is related, being a borrower myself, I think this is directly related to the raise in interest rates. So consumer sentiment is very low, or consumer confidence is very low. And that should mean, again, the textbook tells us that should mean that consumption should decrease, when in fact it hasn't. Well, not by much. It's been increasing. It's just the growth rate in consumption has decreased. So we've got something here. What's going on? Why is sentiment really low and consumption still growing, albeit by a lower rate? And the answer lies in the savings ratio. And I've talked to a few of you about this already. But over COVID, households saved a lot of money. They put it in the bank or they put it in their mortgage offset account. And they're not quite ready to slow down their spending. They're just going to draw down on savings. So they're continuing to consume, just doing it from savings rather than from their income. If we move on to business confidence is quite different to consumer confidence. And I think that's just because of what I just said. Consumers are still spending, so businesses are still happy. So their confidence is quite resilient. And that, remember, is going to lead to investment spending, that I component of AD. We have a depreciating AUD. And I encourage you to think about why that would be. So the AUD could be an AD or an AS factor. Think about why that could be the case. And we're looking at the AUD in terms of the US dollar, so compared to the US dollar. And of course, the answer is in relative interest rates. So the interest rate differential between America and Australia. And you can see this red line here is the US Federal Reserve, which is their central bank. They have just been raising rates quicker and steeper than the RBA in Australia, which is this blue line. And so the differential has just been growing, okay? So relative interest rates has driven a depreciation in the AUD, but also just the US dollar strength. So the economy is in a little bit of a funny time at the moment, and particularly financial markets. And when that happens, they call it a flight to safety. People move their money to US dollars, and that obviously appreciates the USD and depreciates the Australian dollar. But if we look at it in the trade-weighted index terms, which I had a student ask me the other day, the trade-weighted index is actually appreciated. So it just goes to show that depending on which currency you're looking at, you can talk about the appreciation of the TWI. I would probably focus on the depreciation of the AUD against the US dollar. And that's just because these make up a whole range of different currencies, not just the USD. Okay, let's look at some Aes factors. So wage prices, again, a big discussion has been around the labour market this year in the land of economists and the tight labour market. And I've always taught my students in the past that a tight labour market should drive wage prices up. It hasn't happened as much as we would think. It's certainly not in line with inflation. But as an aggregate supply factor, you could be thinking about the increase in wage prices or wage price growth. So wages are growing by more than they were growing in the past. And again, the RBA has been talking about this, and they've been watching this and thinking, will it create inflation? So something to consider. Another big one is the cost of production for firms, and this is mainly around the oil and the natural gas prices, which feed into energy prices, electricity prices. And, you know, there's not a business in Australia that doesn't use electricity or petrol, which comes from crude oil. So something to think about, the cost of production for firms, another Aes factor. All right, let's look at the international economy. The terms of trade has been increasing. This is a terrible graph from the RBA, but that's all we've got. But it has been increasing. And it's mainly been driven by the gas prices that we looked at in the last slide, because we're an exporter of natural gas. We're not an exporter of oil, so that would actually be bad that would increase the import price index. But we're also a big exporter of coal, and the price of coal has skyrocketed over the last couple of months, or over the last year. So that has increased the export price index. If we look at the current account balance, it's the same factors driving the current account balance. You can see this light blue line here. That's the current account, and that's in surplus. So the surplus has been increasing, at least over the last quarter. And it's been driven by an increase in the net goods and net services balance. Okay, remember, credits minus debits. And that's related to what I just mentioned before, which is the increase in natural gas prices and coal prices. Okay, so that leads to, for any given quantity, an increase in the value of those credits on net goods and net goods, not net services. In terms of the primary income, that has been actually decreasing. So we've been sending more money overseas, more debits, and that is because a lot of foreigners own shares in some of our mining companies, coal mining companies, and they've received higher dividends for those high prices. Okay, so again, how will you use all of this stuff? And I probably should say at this point, you obviously don't need to know all this. I'm going to give you everything, and you've got to pick out what works for you. Well, some of these questions would be really important to know those things I just went through. So outline one factor that is contributing to anything, right? Anything we've just discussed. Explain one economic factor that explains the trend in something, or describe how one AD and or one Aes factor has led to XYZ. Okay. Now note here, these questions are saying what is driving it, what did explain it, what has led to it. So it's not a theoretical question. It's asking you to tell the assessor, the examiner, what actually happened in the Australian economy. And here is the question from last year's exam. I just wanted to go through this quickly. So it was to look at the AD and AD and Aes factors that would have explained the RBA getting the forecast for unemployment wrong. Okay, so they thought unemployment was going to be really high this year. We've just looked at it. It's not. It's really low. And so why? What happened in the economy that they didn't expect? So again, there have to be contemporary factors. There have to be real things that happened. So first of all, you just need to understand what the unemployment rate was higher than predicted. So you need to know the current unemployment rate, which we do now. And you needed to show an contemporary aggregate supply factor and a contemporary AD factor that would lead to the unemployment rate being lower than expected. Okay, so just an example of the kind of questions you're going to need to use these factors in. Again, I'm going to go through, there's a couple more questions here. Now, these ones are not asking you specifically for what happened in the economy. They're more general. They say what might have influenced the goal of low inflation, 2 reasons that the government might find it difficult, outline 1 factor that might explain the trend. If I was doing the exam, I would still use contemporary factors because I just think it looks better. But if you can't think of a contemporary factor in this case, you can just use one in theory. Okay, so moving on to budgetary policy. Remember, we've got a huge budget deficit. It's becoming, was way over $100 billion, and it's becoming, well, it's getting smaller, around, I think it was about $70 billion, and the government's hoping to bring it back to surplus. We would call that a highly expansionary stance. You could say it's becoming less expansionary because the deficit's getting a bit smaller, but I definitely think it's highly expansionary. Again, if you're one of those particular students that's looking at the difference between the structural and the cyclical component of the budget, remember the structural component is the component that the government has actually made some discretionary changes around. That's in deficit, which means they're spending more than they're earning. And also the cyclical budget or the automatic stabilizers are also in deficit. So that's the, the tax revenue collected versus welfare paid. Monetary policy, we've got, remember, our neutral rate, which is about 2.5%. And we're lucky because the RBA is just, well, you're lucky, I'm not lucky as a mortgage holder, but the RBA has just increased interest rates above neutrality, which technically means that it's a contractionary stance. VCAR would definitely accept less expansionary or contractionary stance because no one really knows where neutrality actually is. We just assume it's about 2.5%. That's what they kind of say. And also, when you're writing about this, I think it's really helpful to say that it's actually been really a steep tightening, which is just a fancy way of saying they've raised rates very quickly. Usually they kind of do it a bit slow and they wait and see what happens. But this time they've done it very quickly. And again, that's just sort of demonstrating their commitment to getting inflation under control. Okay, so how would you use that one? Well, this is another question with reference to one transmission mechanism. Explain the current monetary policy stance. So you need to know the current stance. All right, I just wanted to quickly run over discretionary policies. I'm not going to give you the details of these because they're written in lots of different resources. But remember, we looked at some infrastructure projects. One is the Bruce Highway, but there's a pipeline of infrastructure, road and rail projects that the government's committed to. I think it's like $117 billion over the next 10 years. And that's an example of an aggregate demand policy, also called a discretionary stabilizer, right? The LMITO, which is a tax cut for middle and low income households, gives them some tax back at the end of the year, increases their disposable income. The temporary expensing for businesses, which is just an incentive for them to invest in new capital equipment, and cuts to the fuel excise tax. Now that I read that there, I don't really like that as an aggregate demand policy, but it would increase discretionary income, at least for the 6 months. Remember, a lot of the budgetary policies have AD and AS impacts. So it's on you to think, well, what's this question asking me to do? So the AS policies, well, we've got some education policies, and you should know one of each. The apprenticeship incentive system, skills for today and tomorrow, job trainer, whatever you choose to do, anything you can find in that CPAP guide is okay. Infrastructure projects we've looked at, R&D and subsidies, I think they're kind of the same thing. There's the money that you can get through the CSIRO for sort of, innovative new business ideas. I think it was like solar and stuff. Have a look at that. Have one policy up your sleeve. Remember immigration, we've increased the intake of skilled migrants, and the new government is committed to increasing it even further. And we've got our tax and welfare reform. So I always like to use the childcare subsidy because that's something that's near and dear to me. And remember that they're allowing parents to get 95% back of the childcare costs for their second child. In terms of tax policy, you could use the LMITO here again, or you could use the new personal tax rates. Again, go and look up those policies, make sure you understand the detail and how they work. All right, finally, just for you to review what we've done in this video. I don't know how long it's gone for, it feels quite long. Remember our goals, you might like to screenshot this or copy this down. Here's our target. Here's the current rate. Have we achieved it? Yes, yes. No, definitely no. Hard no to inflation. Yes, yes to strong and sustainable growth and full employment, with a little caveat. I'm giving you some homework to do this for the aggregate supply factors as well. So copy this down. Wages growth, what's happening to wages growth? The exchange rate, what's happening to that? Cost of production, what's happening to that? And I'm going to get you to do something a little bit different here, because there's a bit of a trade-off between the economy going really well and then what the RBA is likely to do. And of course, we've talked about this a lot. It's because if we grow any more, it's going to create inflation. So something that would be good for growth is not going to be good for the RBA. So just a next step there as well. And the same for aggregate demand factors. I'd take 3: consumer confidence, exchange rate, business confidence. It's up to you. But I think that's a really good way to review what we've done today. If you're this far through the video, well done. And thank you for watching. All the best. Good luck in the exam. Bye for now.